infrastructure, health services, health access, and also even the characteristic of the area. We find that the areas with, for instance, with lower level of education, with lower level of income, also tend to be more vulnerable to natural hazard. So that's also another very important component that determine vulnerability and then risk, right? So we need the three components. And just to emphasize further that it is extremely important, and here is where demography can contribute to understand the demographically differentiated vulnerability, which we should try to understand not only when the hazard happens, affect the population, but how it distributed differentially across different subgroup of population. So let's give you an example of the study that we look at the impact of rainfall variability on stunting. I think yesterday, the Indonesian already present how Indonesia has tried to reduce her stunting in Indonesia as an effort. Globally, even though stunting, which is when children are shorter than the average age, than the average height that they're supposed to reach in their age, so the height for age, it's too short. Globally, it's actually about 1/5, so 20% of children are still stunted. So it has improved a lot. The proportion of children who are stunted has improved, but still 1/5 of a child it's stunted. So that's quite alarming. But now what we like to look at is also what would be the impact of changes in the pattern of rainfall on stunting. It differs across countries actually. So if we look at the x-axis, which is a measurement of average rainfall in zero represents a normal rainfall condition, whereas the plus value, so +1 or +2, would represent the too wet conditions. So wetter than the average, and -1 and -2 would be drier than the average condition. So this is measured in standard deviation, and the y-axis representing the probability of stunting. The differences between Ethiopia and India, what we can see here is that in the case of Ethiopia, it's actually the drier period that tend to increase the probability of stunting. In the case of India, it's a wetter, so the wetter condition, so too much rain, right? Excess rainfall will increase the probability of stunting for children. But what is even more interesting is to compare the differences between boys and girls. So generally, regardless of the rainfall condition, boys tend to be more likely to be stunted than girls. And this is because we're talking about children aged under 5, and this is because boys tend to need more calorie when they grow up, so need more nutrients, and as well as generally boys tend to have more physical activities more than girls, so they really need more calorie. So if the household experiencing food insecurity, so generally boys would tend to be more sensitive to this. And as we can see in the case of Ethiopia, actually there's no difference between boys and girls when household experience drought. On the right-hand side, when we look at India, and this is extremely interesting, in the normal condition, if you see the 0 here in the middle, the average rainfall, in a normal condition, or even in a dry condition, the probability of stunting girls representing by the blue color are actually lower than boys. But when household experience wetter conditions, excess rainfall, actually they're catching up with boys, which is not a good thing because generally biologically girls would be less likely to be stunted than boys. And in this case of the India case, we suspect the literature also shows us that household might practice gender differential feeding pattern that favor boys more than girls. So that's why when household experience food insecurity might tend to feed boys more, and that's why girls suffer more from undernutrition or from stunting. So that's an example here, but we have seen the differences in terms of stunting by gender, but also we can also think of education as a source of demographic heterogeneity, and we have found evidence actually across all the space and across our different unit of analysis, whether we look at individual, household, community, or national level, we actually find that countries or individuals or households with higher level of education tend to have lower vulnerability, whether we measure it as in terms of morbidity, mortality, speed of recovery, or disaster preparedness. And this evidence applies across all type of countries, advanced economies or less developed countries as well. And just to just to be quick on this, why would education contribute to vulnerability reduction? We can think of both the direct ways and indirect ways. So directly, people who go to school learn how to solve problems. They have improved cognitive skills. People with higher level of education tend to have better risk perception, better abstraction skills. They tend to understand more the danger of disasters or of climate change, for instance. And also, of course, indirectly, people with high level of education tend to have larger social networks, better social capital, better access to information, and also higher income, which enables them also to implement the adaptation options as well. So now, just to go back to the example of children aged under 5 stunting in India, what is very interesting is the two line in the middle here. When we compare the children from the household whose mother have high education but poor, with another household, the light blue one, whose mother have low education but rich household. What is interesting here is actually they have this, the children has the same probability of being stunted when they experience rainfall anomalies. And this is just to show that actually higher level of mothers' higher level of education actually can compensate for lower household wealth. And this is interesting also in the context of sustainable development goals. If one think of what to invest, if the government has limited resource, perhaps investing in education can also have a knock-on effect, right? Also reduce vulnerability, maybe change the risk perception, give the people ability to adapt, and so on. And then, of course, have higher income as well. So in this case, it might be worthwhile to invest in education. And it also has implications also for the future. So if you just an example of the population pyramid of Korea, what's the difference in this population pyramid? We also not only showing the population structure by age and sex, but also by their level of education, as you can see from different colors here. So red color represents people with no education. As you can see, in Korea, back in 1970, there were so many people with, especially women with no education, only primary level education. But with educational expansion in Korea also changes over time with people with high level education. Okay, I have 5 minutes left. Yeah, and as you can see, with the change in population composition, and we have already seen some evidence that high level of education also mean lower level of vulnerability. So in this case, when the change in educational structure of the population, it also can also mean that people in the future, if we invest in education, may have higher level of adaptive capacity. So I'm gonna skip the next slide here, with I show how we can use population projection method actually to forecast also into the future how vulnerability and adaptive capacity would look like using different scenarios. So I'm going to move on to the how can we apply such knowledge that we have used in looking at differential vulnerability and forecasting also to the case of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see, I was showing earlier the population pyramid change, and which also represents if we look at different age structures. So in the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, people tend to try to understand why Italy tend to suffer higher case fatality rate. One of the reasons that has been cited regularly is because Italy also has much older age structure compared to, as we know, that the older population have higher susceptibility in case of COVID-19 pandemic. So we also see that maybe the older age structure explained to a certain extent, explained to a certain extent higher vulnerability in the case of Italy. But also, of course, Professor Chin already mentioned that other dimension also that explain vulnerability. We can also already use the existing survey, for instance, the demographic and health survey, to try to understand access to sanitation, which is because of breakdown by geographical, detailed geographical characteristic, also to understand if the household, for instance, had hand washing facility or not. So that's a different application as well. But I want to emphasize slightly some of my work that we look at the gender dimension in understanding the COVID-19 pandemics. There is consistent evidence that show that men have higher morbidity and mortality. So they have even like higher chance of being hospitalization and also higher chance of mortality. And why is this the case? One could think of explaining in terms of biologically, right? So, which is not our expertise. And from demography, you might think that men have the immune system that differ from women. But we may also ask the more sociological type of question. Maybe men are more likely to get infected than women, and that's why they get more infected, and that's why they tend to develop more severe symptoms. That can be the case. Women also tend to be more risk averse than men. They tend to wear more face masks, for instance, tend to have higher vaccination, the rate of vaccination, and so on. So in the concept of risk, again, maybe men are more exposed because of their work, for instance, or maybe they have a lower risk perception, and so on. So that could be the case. So but how do we find out if men are more likely to be infected? We can use surveys, for instance, but one of the data that we can use, especially if we want to look at gender differences in terms of infection for different countries, one of the data that we can use is a reported case of COVID-19. Now, when we use the data on reported cases, the issue is it relies on the test and tracing capacity, right, of different countries. It doesn't mean that if each country, typically we don't test everyone randomly. If women are more likely to go to take a test, for instance, then the rate of infection for women would be higher as well, because they're more likely to make a test more than men and so on. So that's a drawback of using this data, but it can still give us some insight about gender differences. So for instance, this is not very updated data, because different countries feed in the data in a different time period. But roughly, I think this represents pretty much about the first wave, so last year, type of gender differences in the pattern of confirmed cases. It varies greatly across country. One could start already picking up a bit of the pattern of countries with sort of like Qatar, Singapore, Bahrain, Cambodia, Saudi Arabia, for instance, would have much higher proportion of men who are confirmed infected case compared to European countries on the right. And but what is important is we should also look at the pattern of infection, not only by gender differences, but also by age. And what we find, so we collected data for European countries, for non-European countries, and so I try to wrap up. Let me give 2 minutes. Yeah, so what we find here, which is very clear, is actually this is male to female ratio. So when the ratio is lower than 1, it means women are more likely to be infected, and it's greater than when it's men are more likely to be infected. What's interesting is the cutoff age at the age of around 60, up until the age of 60. So the working age women tend to be more infected than men. And after the age of 60, it's more likely to be men are more infected. One of the explanation here is that because in the European country, women are overrepresented in the healthcare related sector, about 75 to 85% of healthcare professional women. So that explains why women are more likely to be infected. So I'm gonna stop right here. And also so we also try to test across other countries. So it tends to be that paradoxically, so countries with higher female labor force participation or higher gender equality would have actually higher proportion of women being infected. And this is just to give you an example of how demographic display can be useful in studying global change research. I'm gonna just stop right here so to take too much time from the others. Yeah, so I would stop sharing my screen.
For a very profound presentation in examining vulnerable populations in differentiated contexts of climate change and COVID-19 exposure. The last paper in our session this afternoon is on population mobility and COVID-19 to be presented by Deepak Nayar, Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He is also the chairperson of the Board of Governors of Center for the Study of Developing Country Societies in New Delhi. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, moderator. I would like to thank the APA for their invitation to speak at this conference. Let me begin with a disclosure. I am not a demographer. I am an economist who works largely on macroeconomics, international economics, and development economics. On reflection, my only plausible connect with the theme of population mobility is the work I did on international migration. But I am going to address a wider canvas on the COVID-19 pandemic and the movement of people. I should also mention that I do not have a PowerPoint, perhaps because I belong to the Jurassic age, but also because I much prefer the spoken word. The movement of people across geographical space is as old as humankind. It began a long time ago, and migration across continents or oceans is at least as old as nation states. There were, of course, invaders and conquerors, the Mongols, the Romans, the Crusades. And there were adventurers and merchants. But I'm thinking much more of the movement of people in search of better livelihoods, better well-being, which goes back at least 5 centuries. Similarly, the movement of microbes, bacteria, germs, viruses across geographical space is just as old. And unlike for people, national borders are no barrier, for these microbes are carried by people or by animals. Let me give you 3 stunning examples from history. In the mid-14th century, in 1347, plague germs were carried by Mongol troops with their horses from Central Asia to the Black Sea, from where they were transmitted by ships to ports around the Mediterranean and then across Europe. The Black Death, an unprecedented human catastrophe, killed more than 25 million people in Europe out of a total population of 80 million in just 3 years, from 1348 to 1351. In the early 16th century, the flotilla led by the explorer Hernan Cortes, 11 ships, 100 sailors, 500 soldiers, and perhaps millions of microbes, touched the Mexican coast in Yucatan and landed in Veracruz in April 1519. Just 2 years later, the mighty Aztec Empire was destroyed, many historians argue, by germs and disease carried from Europe. In the early 20th century, about 100 years ago, at the end of World War I, there was what came to be known as the Spanish flu. As soldiers returned from Europe to their home countries, into North America, to Asia, we had a worldwide pandemic in which an estimated 50 million people died, of whom about 18 million were in India. Now, in the contemporary world, which is an era of globalization, there is a far stronger connect between the movement of people and the movement of germs or viruses across borders. In late 2019, a novel coronavirus emerged from the wet markets of Wuhan, China, by hopping across from animals to humans, or, as some scientists argue, leaked from a laboratory in virology. Soon, this virus caught the highways and bylanes of globalization to quickly encircle the globe, turning the world and our lives upside down. What I've said so far in a preamble is to set the stage before the play begins. My presentation seeks to analyze the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the movement of people, with the focus on its economic aspects. In doing so, it makes a distinction between such movements within countries, from rural hinterlands to urban settlements, and across countries, from labor surplus economies, say in Asia, to labor scarce economies in Asia and elsewhere in the world. The impact, I argue, ranges from reversing the movement of people to curbing the movement of people. In either case, it has a profound adverse impact on livelihoods and well-being of people, ordinary people, with a disproportionately large burden on the poor. What is more, at this juncture, it is unclear, indeed uncertain, whether the post-pandemic world will return to what it was earlier. Now, my presentation divides into two parts. The first is about the movement of people within countries, and the second about the movement of people between countries, referring to intra-country and inter-country population mobility, respectively. Now, the spread of the pandemic led to the imposition of lockdowns almost everywhere in the world. It was the obvious risk-averse strategy for governments. If the spread could be restrained or managed, success would bring political dividends. If the spread continued unabated or worsened, the microbe would take the blame for the failure. This was the equivalent of what is described as the one-way option in financial markets governments could not lose. The option became even more attractive over time as it conformed to herd behavior by governments worldwide. And the neglect of the pandemic by the United States and Italy became examples of this. So that exit from a lockdown then posed a real dilemma for governments. Now, lockdowns varied from being draconian to being stringent to being lax. But almost everywhere, lockdowns led to a shutdown of economic activities. And this shutdown was sudden. And this happened in a large number of Asian countries. Now, migrant workers from rural hinterlands in megacities or large urban settlements far away from their homes lost their livelihoods as manufacturing, services, and all economic activities shut down in megacities. And they were stranded without food or shelter, often at the mercy of local governments or charities, left to fend for themselves in returning home in the rural hinterland to their villages in situation where public transport systems had also shut down. And this became a serious problem in what were large countries in terms of geographical size. They were, of course, deprived of their incomes that helped support the consumption of their families in the village. the essential characteristic of this group of vulnerable people were that their employment was deeply insecure, often casual labor, at best contractual work, with no form of social protection. And this has been the fate of a very large proportion of the population in Asian countries, with the exception of East Asia. Now, lockdowns were lifted after some time, but they were reimposed from time to time as you had second waves, third waves, new variants, and uncertainty remained high, not only for such migrant workers, but also for their employers. Now, there are two important analytical distinctions that are helpful in this context. First, the distinction between the organized and the unorganized sector of economies. And second, the distinction between the manufacturing and services sector of the economy. Now, the only workers who were protected were workers in the organized sector, whether manufacturing or services. But these were not the blue-collar workers. These were the higher level managerial workers, so that working from home online was an option only for this tiny minority. But workers in factories that had shut down, workers in offices that had shut down, had no such option. The most vulnerable, of course, were workers in the unorganized sector. If you think of manufacturing, they were in micro, small, and medium enterprises, often family-based businesses or cottage industries. But the largest number was in the unorganized services sector, whether it was hotels, restaurants, courier services, delivery services, private transport systems, you name it, the unskilled, low-income workers, okay? And they were the worst off in terms of livelihoods lost and income stop. Of course, this might have deprived them and their families of their consumption needs, but even more, they did not have access to healthcare, whether it was vaccinations or COVID healthcare, or whether it was non-COVID healthcare. It was the poor who went without. And we heard about education, children, and it was their children, when schools were shut down, who went without education. The doors to learning opportunities was closed, but they had no online options. Now, the same asymmetries of the organized versus the unorganized sector, of manufacturing versus services, characterize the possibilities and prospects of the return of migrants to their erstwhile employment in megacities. Okay? For workers who were in employment that was insecure, whether casual labor or contract workers, and poor quality, long working hours, poor working conditions, and low wages, often below the minimum wage, return is both uncertain and risky. In sum, the argument I'm developing is that the impact of the pandemic through lockdowns in megacities and in megacities on migrant workers from rural hinterlands was regressive, whether we think of their enforced return to their villages or the prospect of the return to earlier employment from their villages to the megacities. Those at low income levels who were unskilled or semi-skilled with insecure, poor quality employment fared the worst. In contrast, the high income, high skilled, secure employment persons were far less affected, if at all, by the pandemic and the lockdowns. Let me now turn to the movement of people between between countries, that is inter-country population mobility. Now, in the contemporary world, it is possible to distinguish between 5 categories of movements of people, 2 of which forms are old, 3 of which are new. The old categories are immigrants and refugees who move to settle permanently, who move from their home countries to settle permanently in destination countries. Now, both these forms of population mobility have simply been stopped by the pandemic. For those immigrants seeking better futures in industrialized countries, this has simply postponed their day of opportunity. But for refugees, whose migration is distress migration, it has probably confined them to a worse fate. Now, the new categories of inter-country population mobility are guest workers, illegal immigrants, and professionals. Guest workers, whether unskilled, semi-skilled, or low-skilled, move for a specified purpose and a limited duration from Asia, mostly to the oil exporting countries of West Asia, but also now to Malaysia and Singapore. Such guest workers do not have uh, either the rights of workers or the rights of citizens in their host countries. Now, this number is large. In the Gulf countries alone, it is about 20 million. Now, a large proportion of these guest workers were repatriated to or returned voluntarily to their home countries during the pandemic. They lost livelihoods, the economies and their families had to forego remittances. There was a negative impact on the migrant and his or her household, just as there was on the economy of home countries. Now, the prospect of return to their countries of destination for such migrants is minimal. I would say negligible, because they went at most for a period of 2 years as guest workers. Illegal migrants enter countries without a visa or stay on after their visa has expired. Now, governments and employers turn a blind eye to this reality because it is economically profitable and socially convenient for them. Now, the number of illegal migrants in Asia and the world is very, very large. Now, such mobility is impossible now with the draconian restrictions on international travel that even illegal uh, immigrants cannot escape. The third category is professionals, who are people with high levels of education, experience, and qualifications. They might be doctors, lawyers, engineers, academics, bankers, artists, architects. Whose skills are in demand everywhere and who can move from country to country despite draconian immigration laws and restrictive consular practices. For these people are as mobile as capital. Now, mobility of these people is temporarily stopped, of course, by the pandemic, but no one has been repatriated, and this will resume as quickly as restrictions on international travel are withdrawn. My focus so far has been on the supply side, considering the movement of people from low-income labor surplus to high-income labor scarce economies. But in the inter-country movement of people or population mobility, there is also the demand side. Now, the example I will give here, and that's the primary example, is tourism. Okay, the pandemic has stopped the movement of people from high-income industrialized countries who come as tourists to low-income countries, whether in Asia, Africa, Latin America, or the Caribbean. This has led to lost livelihoods and business closures in a very large number of countries. So think of hotels, think of restaurants, think of travel services, think of guide services, think of those who provide transport, local transport to tourists. All of them have lost their livelihoods. Small and medium businesses have closed down. Now, there is a parts dependence in this process. For when the pandemic ends, if we assume that tourism flows will revive, many of these businesses have simply shut down. They do not revive.
The time.
Yeah, and in the interest of equity, may I take 2-3 minutes more? My preceding speakers.
Yes, sir, you can.
May I just conclude? Yeah. Now,
Yes,
what I
sir.
want to say is that there is a parts dependence in this process, and there's a hysteresis in the process. So that short-term occurrences have long-term consequences. In conclusion, just 4 bullet points. First, the COVID-19 pandemic and its associated lockdowns have had a profound impact on population mobility by reversing movements of people and restricting movements of people both within countries and between countries. 2, this has led to a significant, sharp reduction in employment of migrant workers and lost livelihoods, not only for rural migrants in megacities or large urban settlements within countries, but also for temporary migrants and guest workers from, say, surplus labor economies in labor-scarce economies in Asia or elsewhere. The impact on the well-being of such people is enormous. 3, there are striking asymmetries in this process which have placed a disproportionate burden on migrant workers at the bottom of the spectrum of skills and income, while the impact on the mobility or incomes of those at higher skill income levels is relatively far less. And 4, path dependence combined with hysteresis, which I mentioned, could mean that the post-pandemic world will not be more of the same, will not be business as usual for the vulnerable among those associated with population mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for a very insightful presentation. We will now entertain questions from the floor. Just a reminder, please type your question in the question and answer box in your control panel and identify who you want to address the question to. Wendy, can we have the first question, please?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Prof. Pinky. Yeah, there is several questions. First, from Anatolia from Mahidol University to Jin Yang, what should we do, government, families, relevant parties, to prevent or perhaps reduce the impact of COVID-19 pandemic to developmental delays as well as potential for long-term health consequences, particularly for children from low-income households? Yeah, I think we ask one by one.
Okay, thank you for that question. I saw another related question below, and I would probably
you wanna answer together. Okay, for the next question from Noni Mardekasari. This is, I want to know how big impact of pandemic COVID-19 on family life in Singapore. Is there any policy from government to minimize or control the impact on it? Okay, your time.
Yes, so thank you again. Yes, Singapore, compared to a lot of other countries, have done well in terms of controlling for the pandemic spread and the help that government and communities come together to help the families. They have come up with cash assistance to a lot of everyone, actually, but also providing food vouchers, utility vouchers, and so on. But to the low-income population in particular, there were efforts to get laptops, old laptops, for example, to those more disadvantaged population, the ones that I've shown that lived in the rental flat. So you can see that from wave 1 and wave 2, the proportion of household that actually have a laptop has increased substantially from about half to 80-some%. But still, you see a gap of about 15 to 20% of the children who still don't have a laptop or a tablet to work on. Other than these kind of cash and laptop assistance, Singapore government also mobilized community groups to help with food. So where I was showing that there's some proportion of low-income families that worried about their food security, not having enough food. Now, government and grocery stores come together, community centers come together to provide food, to distribute food to those who need it. Those are all some of the things that they have done. In addition, they have one thing that I think has done better is these training for adults to gain new skills and so that they can find jobs, and also assistance for job placement. As I have shown that about 20%, actually overall about 10%, but 20% of those who live in rental housing have someone who lost job and have to change jobs. And so it is very important in order to protect children, you need to get parents have resources and ability to support the family. So income and job assistance are very important. I think what they could do more in response to the first question is also a few other things. One is providing some high quality online resources for everybody. Of course, low-income population would need it even more. Since you see that, in fact, low-income children from low-income families spend a lot of time on digital devices and on TV, watching TV, what kind of, even unsupervised. So what we can do is to provide some free access to these families, so it's easy for them, as long as they're going to watch programs and movies and so on. Give them some high quality educational programs, games, whatever, toys, providing more books, for instance, or book materials online that can be easily and actually low cost, resources to help children to gain more. Other than that, they could also provide more parent-based, training on how to organize their home, establish a rhythm during the day, and providing monitoring and supervision on the kind of work that children needs to do. Of course, a lot of parents need help themselves in order to help children to gain, to be able to learn well online effectively. So those are also important things to do. Singapore government also opens up schools and daycares relatively quickly after the peak period. And I think that is crucial because, as I show, for the low-income population, especially the single parent families who may not have flexibility at their work, they need daycare and they need schools open. So these are all things that can help reduce the gap between different socioeconomic group and children who have special needs.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Jean. Okay, for the next question, actually for Ms. Raya Mutarak, but actually you already answer written, but better if you answer in here. From Prof. Aris Ananta, this is, does COVID-19 affects the impact of climate change on health? Can you answer again?
Yeah, so maybe I just repeat quickly then.
So everybody can hear. your answer.
Yeah, we can also see COVID-19 and climate change and other shocks such as economic recession as the compound risk, right? And one thing that it does interact with each other to increase or trigger vulnerability. So people who have already have lower socioeconomic resources would have more difficulty to cope with all of this compounding risk. That's one thing. And in terms of health, I think we have seen an example of floods and typhoons during the monsoon season this year, that when we want to evacuate people, and where do people go, because we need to practice social distance as well. So I think it does influence and exacerbate each other. And as we can see that people who already live in crowded housing, it's much more difficult to practice social distance.
Yeah, thank you. And for Professor Deepak, this is from Sari Mustika. This is, are there any example of success in overcoming economic, social, and mobility problem for migrant workers in remote areas, in border areas, especially during the lockdown situation?
My answer to that question is straightforward. There are almost no examples of success in overcoming economic, social mobility problems for migrant workers in remote areas, because almost every constraint is accentuated in remote areas, whether it is the availability of alternative employment opportunities, a social infrastructure in terms of education and health. It could well be that in some remote area, there is an extraordinary leader, civil society, a government who has made a special effort. But in general, I would say that this possibility in remote areas is significantly less than it is elsewhere. I see 2 or 3 other questions, moderator. May I address them?
Okay.
There is a question from Iwi Arafin, if I'm pronouncing it.
Yeah, this is further question.
Correctly, that how would I predict future population mobility if the COVID-19 stays with us for another 5 years? It's a good question. If restrictions on international travel continue for 5 years, I hope and think they will not. There is a set of jobs in rich industrialized countries, oil exporting countries in West Asia, that are dirty, demanding, or dangerous, okay? In the world, in the lexicon of those who study migration. And they will find means of circumventing immigration laws, consular restrictions. Governments and employers will turn a blind eye, and you will almost certainly see an increase in illegal immigrants. But we could also see an increase in the number of guest workers, because after all, countries are already relaxing restrictions in a selective mode, so that it is possible for countries to give work permits to guest workers for specified purposes, for limited durations. So we could see a revival both of the guest worker syndrome and of illegal immigration, because there are jobs to be done in high-income countries which no resident or citizen is willing to do. So there will be ways around it. I also see a question from Aris Ananta. How can people utilize digital technology to reduce the impact of COVID-19 on employment among informal sectors and SMEs? I think, Aris, we have to make a distinction here between the unorganized sector in manufacturing and the unorganized sector in services. In the unorganized sector in manufacturing, which is mostly micro and small enterprises, we need to make a distinction between white-collar workers and blue-collar workers. Yeah? White-collar workers could be re-employed or reutilized using digital technologies if the employer has resources enough to provide the person with an access to an iPad or to a smartphone. However, blue-collar workers, unless we work in a factory that has robotics, in SMEs or MSMEs, that is out. Blue-collar workers actually have to go to a workplace to do their work. So digital technology is not going to help someone who works on an assembler line, who works in a garments factory. They have to actually go there. Now, if we look at the unorganized services sector, typically where barriers to entry are low, levels of skills and education are low, people with almost no education come from rural hinterlands, find some employment in these activities. They may drive cycle rickshaws, they may drive auto rickshaws, they may work in roadside restaurants, they may work in courier services, a whole range of, they may be domestic workers, okay? Now, the problem here is that the use of digital technologies is simply not possible. The reason is that you need physical proximity for the producer to deliver a service to the consumer, or for the consumer to go to the producer and buy that service. Unlike goods, services are not disembodied. They are not tangible. They're intangible. And when producers and consumers have to meet each other for the service to be performed, to be delivered, digital technology, except at the high-end tech, give you an example of Amazon, is not really the way forward. One last question I see from, oh, well, I see more, but you can decide which ones.
Okay, you can choose one of them.
Yeah, from Preeti Dhillon, what is the impact of the pandemic on the women workforce? And I would add women in general, Preeti. I think, you know, when you have insecure employment, poor quality employment in the informal sector, women are that much more vulnerable. They are the first to go. Second, a large number of these migrants come without their families to work in megacities. So the vulnerability of women who stay on in their villages, in their home, is in some sense greater. Yeah? I don't know whether that answers your question. Given the paucity of time, I cannot take any longer. I see, you know, I see 3-4 more questions, Mr. Moderator. Do you want me to address 1 or 2 of them? I will. It depends.
Okay. Later on, I will give opportunities to Ms. Raya. This is one question for you. This is, can you explain, is there any correlation between life expectancy between men and women with your conclusion that saying men likely higher risk to infected?
Yes, actually, this is also the work that I have done to look at the impact of COVID-19 on life expectancy. And for COVID-19 to have impact on life expectancy, mortality has to be high, so high enough to affect the life table and so on. And so women of the working age tend to be more infected, at least in European countries, but luckily they don't die. It's actually men of older age after 60 tend to die more. And then we did pick up the excess mortality, particularly for men, and in certain area, especially in Europe, like the first area where the COVID-19 hit hard, like in certain northern cities of Italy, for instance. So life expectancy, it's, of course, we're talking about period life expectancy, could reduce by 5 years, for instance, for men, but 2 years for women, because women die less. And I think one thing that when we talk about life expectancy in this case, we have to see this year, for instance, in the case of Europe, vaccination has been picked up, and if mortality did drop, and in fact it did drop, even though with high infection rate, we wouldn't probably see the drop in life expectancy as we have observed in 2020.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, because it's very limited time, so I give time to the Prof. Pinky.
Thank you, Wendy. Actually, this is already the end of this session, and we can only speculate on the various post-pandemic scenarios that will happen regarding demographic outcomes in our respective countries. And I believe a major challenge actually is in the development of innovative data collection methods because of the different restrictions that are in place. So I wish to thank everyone for joining us. You can click on the next relevant breakout room for another interesting session. Thank you again for joining us, for the presenters and those who are present here who listen to the presentations.
And we have a picture first, Prof. Pinky.
Yes, sure. Can you please open your camera, everyone, please? Okay.
Okay, finish. Okay, thank you very much for all the presenters and Prof. Pinky as a moderator one. Thank you very much for your very fruitful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. See you in the breakout room.
Thank you.
Thank you.